and welcome to Your Vote Counts 2024 ballot measure program. My name is Bernadine Anderson, and also presenting today is Janet Atkins. We're members of the League of Women Voters of Marion and Polk counties. From the very beginning in 1920, and now over 100 years later, our nonpartisan mission was and is to foster education in citizenship and to support improved legislation. Our purpose is to provide unbiased information so voters can make informed decisions. Members across the state have researched these ballot measures using the Secretary of State website, input from sponsors and opponents, information from legislators and their staff, and from verified news reports.
5 state measures have qualified for our 2024 November ballot. Measures 115 and 116 are legislative referrals, and they are proposed constitutional amendments. Measure 117 is also a legislative referral, but would be statutory instead of constitutional. Measures 118 and 19 were brought to the ballot by initiative petition, meaning signatures were collected and submitted to the Secretary of State by a specific due date in order to be approved for the ballot. Measures 117, 118, and 119 are statutory amendments, meaning if passed, modifications could later be made by the legislature or by the courts.
Let's begin then with Measure 115, with the short title of Impeachment of Elected State Executives Amendment. This measure was referred to the voters by the 2023 state legislature and amends the Constitution. There's no financial impact on local government expenditures or revenues. There's minimal financial impact on state legislative expenditures. And if the trial occurs during the regularly scheduled sessions, then there is no additional cost. However, it does require a special legislative session that would incur increased costs, especially if it lasts more than 4 days. This cost could surpass $100,000. In voting yes for this measure, and it passes, the Oregon legislature would have the power to impeach and remove elected state executives. The measure encodes a procedure for impeachment in our state constitution. It involves the House of Representatives voting to charge the official and the Oregon Senate who will then hold the court case, with the presider being the Chief Justice of our Oregon Supreme Court. Both of these require a 2/3 majority. In voting no and causing a failure of the measure, the Oregon legislature would not have the power to impeach the governor or other state executive officials. So what does the proposal say? Although Oregon voters can organize a recall election that addresses removal of executive state officials, Oregon is the only state right now that in the union without the legislative ability to impeach the governor. In 2023, the impeachment amendment language passed by a wide margin in both legislative houses. Ballot Measure 115, as we said, amends the Oregon Constitution that would allow the legislature to impeach and remove these elected state executives. That would include the governor, the Secretary of State, the Attorney General, the Treasurer, and the State Labor Commissioner. The Senate would be given the right to, with 2/3 vote, to charge the official with an impeachable offense, such as malfeasance or corrupt conduct in office, willful neglect of duty, and any other felony or high crime. If the Oregon House votes by 2/3 in favor of charging the official, then the Oregon State Senate would function as the court of impeachment. They would hear the case and they would vote on whether to convict. A 2/3 majority would be required to convict. Those in support of this measure feel that it's necessary to have this process available to legislators. They also feel that even though Oregonians can call for recall, the recall process is onerous and the official will have had to have served for at least 6 months. Supporters believe that this is the ultimate just in case kind of tool for the toolbox for our legislature. Those opposed are not in any organized opposition to the measure at this time, although the Oregon Senate in the past felt that the measure was unnecessary and that the recall process was adequate to protect citizens. However, Jim Moore of Pacific University stated that the process to impeach any member of the executive, he felt that it would turn into a partisan fist fight. This is Measure 115.
Thank you. Going on to Ballot Measure 116, the short title, the State Compensation Commission. The official title is that it amends the Constitution, establishes an independent public service compensation commission to determine salaries for specified officials, and eliminates the legislative authority to set such salaries. So that's a short description that would appear on your ballot. Going a little further, this measure is a constitutional amendment referred to the voters by the 2023 legislature by a vote of 47 in favor of the referral and 3 against in the House, and 21 in favor, 4 against in the Senate. Under the measure, the commission would set salaries for the governor, treasurer, attorney general, commissioner of the Bureau of Labor and Industries, Supreme Court justices, other judicial branch justices, state senators, state representatives, and district attorneys. As for the financial impact of the measure, costs related to it are indeterminate because once the commission is in service, it would determine salaries paid to the listed public officials. Any salary increases approved would come from the state budget, mostly the general fund. So the results in this measure of a yes vote, if it passes, the commission would be created and its work would determine appropriate salaries for the positions assigned. And then the results of a no vote, if it fails, the commission would not be created and the current salary setting process by the legislature would be continued. By way of background, Oregon law currently requires each county to appoint a compensation board to recommend salaries for various officials. They do not set the salaries, but they recommend them. There is currently no similar requirement for the state to do so. Although the legislature established a public officials compensation commission in 1983 to advise on salaries, the seats became vacant in 2000. The commission was revitalized in 2007, but in 2008 was unfunded during the recession and after, and then it was finally eliminated in 2017. This previous compensation commission was permitted only to recommend salaries, not to set them. Currently, 21 states set compensation or receive input from an independent commission on salaries. Part of the impetus for this measure is our comparatively low salaries. A national study of salaries paid in 2022 showed that Oregon's governor earned $98,600, the 4th lowest in the U.S. The salary for the Attorney General was the lowest in the country, and the salary for the Treasurer was the 2nd lowest in the country. Legislator salaries are also considered low. So supporters of this measure say, first, that we need to set salaries for our elected officials that reflect the responsibilities of the jobs. Second, that regarding the salaries for legislators, the measure allows the Commission to consider the concern that some Oregon residents with average or even lower incomes are not financially able to serve in these legislative positions, and the positions require an extensive time commitment that make it difficult to have another job. Third, Oregon needs salary decisions independent of political pressures. And fourth, the measure removes decision-making authority over salaries from the beneficiaries of those decisions. And while there's no organized opposition to this measure, opponents, some of whom support higher salaries, say the elected legislature should maintain authority over these salaries that have an effect on the state budget, and that a compensation commission should be advisory only. So just a recap, this is a referral to voters from the legislature. It establishes an independent public service compensation commission. So if approved by voters, this commission will have the authority to determine salaries for governor, treasurer, attorney general, BOLI commissioner, Supreme Court judges, and other judicial branch judges, as well as state senators, state representatives, and district attorneys. The measure also establishes that any officer or employee of the state of Oregon, a registered lobbyist, or an immediate family member is prohibited from serving on the commission. So that's Measure 116.
So let's take a look at Measure 117, entitled Statewide Ranked Choice Voting, also known as RCV. This is a statutory amendment that was referred to voters by the 2023 Oregon legislature. The cost has several factors. It's estimated to cost the state government approximately $0.9 million during the 2023-25 biennium, with increased costs continuing into 2025 through 2027. These costs will pay for the Secretary of State's needed staff and consulting services to begin carrying out the measure. Local government costs are less known. County costs from the clerks currently estimate that the measure would cost $2.3 million initially. This funding would be used to improve technology, train staff, and test the new system. Every statewide election would cost an additional $1.8 million for the added printing and logistics that would be involved. Software and maintenance costs would also add additional. In voting for a yes vote or a no vote, a yes vote would give the voters the option to rank candidates in order of preference for those specified federal and statewide offices. It also establishes a process for tallying the votes in rounds, with the candidate receiving the fewest votes in each round being defeated. Those votes on the ballots would then be redistributed within each round. A candidate must receive a majority of votes in the final vote, in the final counting round of 50% plus 1. The no vote retains our current voting system. Each voter selecting one candidate for federal and statewide offices. The candidate with the most votes win. This is not necessarily a majority vote. It could be 20% or 30%, but it's the most votes. Now let's look at the proposal. The proposal will change the current voting method for certain statewide offices in Oregon. Instead of a pick-one election, in which the majority win is not required, it will adopt a method that we're calling ranked choice voting. Voters would have, as we said, the option to rank the candidates in their order of preference, first choice, second choice, third choice, etc. They can also just choose one candidate as we can now. Only their active choice is the one that would count for any round. The final round would require a majority winner. So what does this look like? When votes are counted, if no candidate receives a majority of the votes, which is 50% plus one, of voters' first choices, the votes are tallied in automatic runoffs. The candidate receiving the fewest votes in that round are defeated. Those voters who mark that defeated candidate as their first choice will then have their vote automatically counted for their next choice. And then continuing down the line with automatic rounds until there is a majority achieved. These automatic rounds do continue until we get that majority. The change will take effect in 2028, and it will be valid for both primaries and for general election. It won't include those our Oregon senators and our Oregon representatives. It will include all elections in which voters throughout the state can participate. These are U.S. President and Vice President, U.S. Senators and Representatives, Oregon Governor, Oregon Secretary of State, State Treasurer, State Attorney General, and State Commissioner of Bureau of Land, Labor, and Industries. It allows special rules for electing multiple winners. It authorizes cities or counties to adopt ranked choice voting if they so choose, and if that isn't in conflict with their individual city charters. And importantly, it includes provisions for community-based education to understand the new system. This plan will be developed by the Secretary of State. Supporters and opponents have several comments. Supporters say that the final winner is supported by a majority of Oregonians in the repeated rounds of elimination. Conversely, in our current system, a candidate can win with a very small percentage of the voting. Secondly, over 50 jurisdictions already use ranked choice voting, and they also feel that because of this, that campaigns now tend, under the RCV, tend to have more talk of policies rather than involving talk of personalities. Supporters continue to say that this allows voters to vote their hopes and not their fears. Voters can express true preferences, knowing that any further choices never hurt their favorite candidate, thus avoiding splitting the vote or having spoilers. Next, supporters say that Measure 117 gives voters more choices and more voice on their ballots. Continuing with supporters, we find that with Measure 117, candidates will need to campaign for all their votes. It ensures a meaningful ballot no matter where you live. Whether an urban Republican or a rural farming Democrat, your vote matters more. Ranked choice voting has been used and proven around the world. But let's hear what opponents say. Ranked choice voting is more difficult than our typical pick one. It will require education and expense towards that education. Secondly, all changes to our election system, whether difficult or simple, demand this voter education. And that means increasing the cost for election officials, hiring more educators to disseminate materials. They say that it can lead to ballot confusion. Third, those wishing to promote alternative perspectives and philosophies may feel that this system is unfairly favoring moderate voters. Next, opponents say that although most Oregon vendors of ballot counting machines use equipment that can accommodate ranked choice voting, counties will still be charged with implementation costs for software upgrades. Counties would struggle to have the full results, to share the full results with the Secretary of State in order to certify the election. Hand counting of these ballots during audits would be very complex. Opponents continue by saying it does not include some of the most important races within Oregon, such as our Oregon state legislators. Lastly, opponents believe that ranked choice voting can disadvantage party structure by pitting party candidates against each other and then letting the other party gain. This is Measure 117 and ranked choice voting.
Thanks, Deanie. Moving on to ballot measure 118, official title that'll appear on the ballot is that it increases the corporate minimum tax, distributes revenue to eligible individuals, and the state would replace reduced federal funds. Measure 118 was placed on the ballot through an initiative petition drive, and again, it amends statutes, not the Constitution. As to its financial impact, this measure creates the Oregon Rebate Program, which would partially be funded by a new corporate minimum tax of 3% on corporate sales above $25 million. The rebate program would distribute the net revenue from the new tax to Oregon residents, including children via their parents or guardians, in equal amounts. The measure requires that individuals who lose federal income-based benefits because of this new revenue in the rebate will be held harmless, and those payments would likely be made up by the new revenue. According to the Legislative Revenue Office, following phase-in, the direct and indirect costs of the rebate program are expected to exceed the new revenue from the measure. A yes vote would increase the corporate minimum tax on Oregon sales exceeding $25 million, would eliminate the current cap of $100,000 on the corporate minimum tax that we already have, and replace any reduced federal benefits to individuals. A no vote, if the measure fails, would retain the existing corporate minimum tax, which varies by tax bracket, and would retain its $100,000 cap. For background, based on the use of federal supplemental income programs, Oregon has a relatively large population of low-income residents. For example, SNAP benefits, formerly known as food stamps, were used by 17% of Oregon's population in 2023, compared to 11% in Washington and 12% in California. Similarly, the participation in Head Start programs was higher in Oregon. One suggestion for helping to raise people out of poverty is a universal basic income program, which is designed to alleviate poverty and potentially replace other need-based social programs. The challenge is funding such a program. This ballot measure is designed to provide a universal basic income for Oregonians starting in 2026 by distributing this new corporate income tax on sales. It's important to note that the estimated payments would go to residents, all residents, not just low-income residents, with eligibility based on at least 200 days of residency in the previous calendar year. So as to the proposal and some of its effects, the new corporate minimum tax of 3% on C and S corporations with corporate sales above $25 million and distribution of that new revenue to all residents. The measure analysis by the Legislative Revenue Office concluded that the measure would raise on the order of $7 billion a year. The average rebate paid in 2026, based on 2025 tax year returns, is expected to be about $1,160 per person and to increase to over $1,600 per person in later years. The Revenue Office estimates that following the phase-in, though, biennial costs of the rebate program to the state are expected to exceed the new biennial revenue. Some costs would be offset by the new tax revenue, but the overall result would be a loss of substantial discretionary funds the state currently uses for schools, public safety, health, and other programs. A couple reasons for this revenue reduction that isn't obvious under the measure. Because S corporations do not pay taxes as an entity, but rather pass the taxable income and the tax liability to their shareholders, when these individual shareholders pay for the new tax, it will reduce their incomes and result in a reduction from their former tax level that went to the general fund. S corporations are also expected to lower their pass-through payments to shareholders if the measure passes, lowering the shareholders' taxable income further by doing so. These reductions in personal income tax revenue to the state would start at an estimated $12 million but rise to $100 million a year, which will, as noted before, affect general fund programs. And for C corporations under current law, roughly 40% of C corporations with Oregon sales above $25 million are now required to pay the minimum tax because it is larger than their rates tax. But under Measure 118, it's estimated that that percentage would rise to roughly 90% of C corporations. So the tax owed by many C corporations would move from the rates tax to the minimum tax. This would mean an increase in revenue to the state from the minimum tax to pay for the new rebate, but a reduction in revenue to the state from the rates tax, which pays for everything else. The Revenue Office predicts other changes to the economy as a result of the measure that would reduce state revenues further by an estimated $75 to $200 million a year by 2028. Further, administrative costs are expected to be substantial. The Revenue Office estimates that an additional almost 200 permanent employees will be needed to manage the process. Computer systems that handle individual tax returns, which is the largest single operation in the tax arm of the government, will have to marry with the social service arm to determine who is eligible for the rebate by their residency status and what federal programs they now participate in that might need to be replaced by state funds due to the hold harmless provision of the measure. So supporters of this measure say that families who are struggling would receive a lifeline from the funds in this rebate. Again, projections show that each Oregonian would receive about $1,600 a year. Studies show that recipients of funds from pilot programs like these increase their expenditures on essentials like food, housing, and transportation, and are more likely to visit a doctor or a dentist. In addition, supporters say this tax, which is only on large corporations with sales of $25 million or more in the state, will make corporations pay their fair share. Currently, many large corporations have tax rates of less than 1%. Meanwhile, opponents of the measure, Measure 118, say, first, the proposed tax is on sales, not profits, which makes it difficult for low-margin businesses to remain profitable, inevitably forcing price increases which will be passed on to the consumer and could also result in businesses leaving the state. Secondly, opponents say Oregon is currently ranked 28th in the nation in terms of corporate taxes, so this is kind of the middle of the pack. But if this tax passes, Oregon may be on the list of the 10 worst business tax climates, discouraging companies from moving to Oregon and encouraging current employers to leave, possibly. Third, the rebate under the measure would go to all residents equally, then this would include high-income residents. Government officials say the bill would be a tremendous strain on our state, including a potential impact of more than $2.8 billion on state resources and deep cuts to important frontline services like healthcare and public safety. Nonpartisan research also indicates that Measure 118 would increase prices for consumer goods, which would be inflationary, and could affect Oregon's job growth. So again, this list of opponents of the measure, these are some of the reasons for the stated opposition to the measure by the governor and Republican and Democratic leadership offices in both the House and the Senate. So that's Measure 118, Deanie.
Our last statewide ballot measure that you will see on your ballot is Ballot Measure 119, Cannabis Industry Unionization Rules. This is a statutory amendment placed on the ballot by initiative petition. As determined by the Oregon Legislative Revenue Office, this measure does not have a significant direct or indirect economic or fiscal impact. In voting yes for this, it would have the effect of having cannabis retailers and certain cannabis license holders required to be a party to a labor peace agreement, and in that agreement they would need to remain neutral when the labor organizations communicate with the employees about such things as collective bargaining and other possibilities. This would affect the employer's possibility of a license and certification and comes with penalties if this is not abided by. A no vote would be that our current labor laws stay in place, which means that there is no requirement for cannabis retailers or processors to enter into a labor peace agreement. This measure proposes to affect a little over 7,500 people that work in the Oregon cannabis industry. And Oregon employees have bargaining rights that are governed by the Oregon Revised Statutes that guarantee such things as the right to self-organization, strikes, collective bargaining through representatives, and the right to join a union. Employees also have the right not to engage in these activities unless their membership is contingent upon their employment. Enforcement of these rules are in the hands of the Oregon Labor Relations Board. This measure addresses an ambiguity that is between the federal, in which cannabis is considered an illegal industry, and that of Oregon, where it has legal status. So therefore, this does affect unionization rights. Under Measure 119, the Oregon Liquor and Cannabis Commission would require cannabis retailers and processors to enter into this labor peace agreement with a labor organization, and that would be a requirement in order to get their state license. The failure to sign this labor peace agreement or failure to follow the agreement rules could result in penalties. That might be fines, it might be denial or suspension, or revoking the retailer or processor's certification or their license. If the labor peace agreement is violated or terminated, the OLCC can, and they terminate this within 10 days, and the OLCC would expect a new agreement to come within 30 days. If the licensee does not submit this new labor peace agreement within those 30 days, then the Measure 119 gives the Commission, OLCC, the right to suspend their license for 30 days or to impose an under $2,000 fine. Those in support of Measure 119 have this to say. They feel that the measure would ensure that the cannabis workers' freedoms to organize and collectively bargain are protected under the state law by closing this ambiguity loophole. Secondly, they feel that the Oregon cannabis workers currently have quite a bit of challenge in trying to voice their concerns about safety and product standards. Because of the inadequate labor protections, those who attempt to raise concerns about toxicity, inadequate protection gear, don't come forward, and they just continue to work under those substandard conditions. Measure 119, according to supporters, also would allow cannabis workers to have the same protections as in other states. And some of those states are California, Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, and Virginia. Opponents come back and they say that this measure 119 would cause the employers to forfeit the rights to inform workers about facts that the employers know to be true, including the employer's experience with the unions and their opinions about them. Secondly, under the National Labor Relations Acts, states may not require private employers to enter into labor peace agreements unless the state is acting as a market participant by being either a party or a contract with a private business or purchasing its goods. There's no provisions in Measure 119 that concern our state as either a party to the contract or a purchaser of goods. Therefore, opponents believe that this measure would violate federal law. Lastly, opponents say the labor peace agreement that Measure 119 requires is one-sided in favor of the workers, because it does require cannabis businesses to remain neutral on communications with labor organizations, and yet it does not require labor organizations to give up anything. This is ballot measure 119.
Thank you, Deanie. So that has been our presentation of the measures, and we'd like you to reach out to your community, encourage them to get ready, get informed, and vote in the 2024 general election. A couple of helpful resources include the Oregon Secretary of State's My Vote website for things like checking and updating your registration and checking your ballot status. You can use vote411.org for candidate and ballot information, and watch Capitol Community Media channels or go to YouTube for Your Vote Counts programs. You have until October 15th to register or make registration changes like name changes or address changes. The ballots will be mailed out about October 16th and will be docketed and counted if they are received with a postmark on or before November 5th.
We extend our thanks to Capitol Community Media for their expert technical and production skills that were used to create this program. We also thank the League of Women Voters of Marion and Polk Counties for the design, preparation, and presentation of this ballot measure program. And thanks to you for investing your time in watching this program in order to be an informed voter. Please see vote41.org for candidate and ballot measure information, which is now live. Elections matter, so remember to vote because your vote counts.